Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about finding your immigrant ancestor. No matter when they came into this country, whether they came in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, even if they came in the early part of the 1900s, there are some basic principles that are going to apply to all of your immigrant ancestors as to finding out exactly where they came from. And really, that is one of the things that we're looking for. We're looking to find out specifically where they came from, not just a country or a region, but very often in order to continue our research into that particular family line, we need to know a specific county or town name in order to continue that research. And so today we're just going to talk about some of the steps that you can take or some of the processes that you should use in order to uncover that information about your immigrant ancestor. And we're going to frame it with the genealogical proof standard. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, let's talk about the questions that we need to be asking. The question that we're most often asking about our immigrant ancestor is, where are they from, specifically, and when did they immigrate? There's a lot of information and speculation, a lot of times that gets passed around through families about particular immigrant ancestors, about where they might have been from or where they said they were from. And so when you conduct your reasonably exhaustive search into the information, as you're trying to find the information about where they came from, you need to be really careful about making sure that you do conduct a reasonably exhaustive search. Family stories are great. They are a source of information, but they should not be your only source of information. And family stories should not somehow become more prioritized as a source or carry more weight as a source than some of the other things you might be able to look at. Now, if your ancestor came into the United States following or lived in the United States following 1850, here in the U.S., one of the questions that gets asked on a census record for individuals is, where were you born? Now, you'll want to collect all the census records for the individual from 1850 through to their death, and you're going to want to collect the census records for their children. Starting in 1880, the census asks not just where were you born, but where was your father born and where was your mother born? And so you're going to want to pay close attention to that. Again, you're going to want to collect all of the census records for all of the children to list what, to note what they say about the birthplace of their mother or father. Now, the explicit instructions on most of the censuses was that they were supposed to list either the state or the country where the person was born. So typically, a census record is not going to give you much more detailed information than just a country. However, sometimes the census takers got really specific. Or sometimes, depending on the political climate of the time, they listed a little bit more detailed information. For example, do you know the difference between someone born in Ireland and someone born in the Free Irish State? Those are two distinct birth locations listed on census records for people from Ireland. And so knowing the difference and knowing what that means will help you get a little bit closer to pinpointing a specific location for your ancestor. Similarly, Germany, as we know it today, was not always a country, okay? It was a series of kingdoms and principalities, and so sometimes, rather than just listing Germany, the census taker would be very specific. They would list Saxony, or they would list Württemberg. And so again, pay attention to those census records for individuals and for children. Now that answers the question or gets you closer to the question, where are they from? The other question you've got there is, when did they immigrate? Starting in 1900, The census records actually list the year of immigration. 1900 through 1930, every census, every federal census lists the year of immigration. That's great if your family came or was living in the United States after 1900. Again, though, if you collect census records for all the children, even if your ancestor came in the late 1700s, you may find some clues about when they immigrated. For example, tracing all of the children in a family to determine where each of those children was born could give you a time frame for immigration. If the first 2 or 3 children were born in the old country, and then the rest of the 7 or 8 children were born here in the United States, now you've got a very specific time frame for immigration, even if they immigrated prior to 1900. So census records are a really great foundational research tool for immigration. The other thing that census records oftentimes include from 1900 to 1930 is naturalization status. And that's important because naturalization paperwork will oftentimes lead you directly to the date, the port, and the ship that the person arrived on. So pay attention to those census records, specifically that naturalization and immigration information for your ancestor. Another record that is likely to have information about a person's place of origin is a death record. Death records very often will list a place of birth. Again, it may just list a country, but sometimes you'll get lucky and it might list a specific county or a specific town where the person originated from. Keep in mind, it also sometimes death records will list parents' names and birthplaces. So if the informant had that information, you're looking at some really great information. Birth records and death records of the children of a family. Again, we're looking into this holistic family research rather than just tracing your ancestors, your person who you descend from, and their parents and their parents and their parents. You need to look at entire families. Very often, the birth and death records of children will list the birthplaces of their parents. And sometimes those get really specific, especially when it's a birth record, because the person providing the information for that birth record is often the parent themselves. And so it's more likely to be more accurate in that case. Death records, of course, you have to take just kind of like with a grain of salt, just like you do family stories and census records, because you don't know what the informant knew. In the case of census records, you don't even know who the informant was. In the case of death records, you know who the informant is, but you don't always know what they knew. You know, did they know the parents? Did they know specifically where they were from? Or had they just been told a family story that they continued to pass along? So all of these are important. You want to collect all of them, but you need to kind of keep in mind, don't stop with one record because it has a specific piece of information and claim that to be definitive. Continue your reasonably exhaustive search. Now, starting in the late 1700s, people in the United States could become naturalized citizens. And that naturalization process has changed over time, but there has always been some kind of paperwork created. And as time went on, that naturalization paperwork became more and more detailed, asking information about specific dates and places of birth, asking them to renounce loyalty to the particular government of the country that they came from. Sometimes, actually all the time up until about 1922, children and spouses, children and wives, were naturalized under the father or the head of household. And so the wife's place of birth might be listed on her husband's naturalization paperwork. Same with those children, those underage children who might have been born before the family moved to the United States. Naturalization paperwork, if they were naturalized in a federal or a district court, those records are online at Ancestry. And so you can go to Ancestry, go into the card catalog, do a search for naturalization, or use the filters in the card catalog to find those naturalization records, and make sure that you look at every page. Sometimes those naturalization documents are 3 and 4 and 5 pages long. Make sure you read through all of them. If they were naturalized in a county court, and you don't know until you start looking, if they were naturalized in a county court, most of those records are still held at the county level. And so you'll need to contact the local county courthouse and see where their naturalization records are for the time period that you're interested in. Another type of record that is really excellent for learning more about your immigrant ancestor is alien registrations. Alien registrations were required at different times in U.S. history, usually in times of war, and it was for those who had not yet naturalized or had not yet become U.S. citizens, or those who had no intention of becoming U.S. citizens. They were to go to their local post office and just register their name, their date of birth, their place of birth, where they were living, and what their intentions were here in this country. Those alien registration records are held by the National Archives, and those are really excellent if your ancestor did not naturalize. Passport applications, and you can see an example of that here on the left-hand side of the screen. Passport applications are another really great resource. Now, passport applications exist for people who are U.S. citizens or for people who became U.S. citizens. And, you think about your immigrant ancestor leaving a particular place, Ireland, Italy, Poland, wherever they may have left, and coming to the United States and seeking a better life, and sometimes we think that they never looked back. And that is true for a great number of them. However, there are those who did go back and forth. In particularly, like I think about the Italians, the Italian men. They were nicknamed birds of passage, and basically they were kind of like the migrant workers of their day. They would go, come to the United States and work and earn money, and then go back to Italy for a while, and then come back to the United States, then go back to Italy. And sometimes they would go 4 and 5 times before finally settling either in the United States or back in Italy. And if they had become a U.S. citizen during that process, at any point during that time, in order to go back to Italy, they would need a passport. If they had children born here in the United States, and those children were U.S. citizens, and then they wanted to go back to Italy to visit, they would need a passport application. And so a lot of times, we again, remember, not just for the immigrant ancestor, but for their children, look for some of these records and you'll get detailed information. Maybe they were born in the United States, but they'll list the specific town in Italy that they're going to visit. And that's a huge clue about where they might be from. I use Italy as an example, but certainly Italians are not the only ones who fall into this category. English, Irish, German, French, a lot of different nationalities. People were a little bit more transient than sometimes we give them credit for being. Those passport applications, again, date back to the late 1700s, and they are available on Ancestry. And I'll show you where all those things can be found in just a moment. The final thing on my list, and I put it at the end intentionally, because one of the things I've discovered is that a lot of you try to start here and have a frustrating experience. Passenger lists should be searched, but I never search them until I've done all this other reasonably exhaustive search first. And there are a few reasons for that. One is passenger lists from the 1600s, the 1700s, even the early 1800s, sometimes, most often, list nothing more than a name and the name of the ship and the date it arrived. So I'm not going to know if this is my person unless I have more information. Just looking at a John O'Brien from Ireland who arrived on a ship, sometime in the mid-1800s, it's not enough to know if this is mine. As a matter of fact, I think I've done that search once, and I think that there were more than 500 men with that name who came in a 10-year time span. And so how do I know which one is my person when the only thing on the passenger list is the name? Okay, so you have to do some of this other work first so that you can get a more narrow time frame from when they came, so that you have an understanding more specifically about where they came from. If you can get, again, to a county or a town level using U.S. records, you're going to be so much more successful. It's also going to help you identify in some of those passenger lists where the only thing listed is a name, it's going to help you identify that you've got the right person. Oftentimes in those passenger lists, what you're going to see is that communities of people, whether it's a congregation or a neighborhood or a family or an extended family group or a couple of farmers from a local area, whatever, some type of community of people typically traveled together. Very, very rarely do people travel in complete isolation. And so what you can tell then from the passenger list, if you've done all this other research and you know that your person is from County Down and from this particular townland in County Down, Ireland, then you can look at the others on that passenger list and determine, is my person, this might be my person, all these other people are also from the same town, then that increases the likelihood that you've got the right passenger list. So passenger lists, again, prior to about 1870, 1880, all they listed was just a name very often. And so you have to make sure you've done this other work so that you know you have the right person. After that, passenger lists have tons of information. A lot of times they'll list how much money the person had in their pocket, how tall they were, if they had any distinguishing marks. They'll also list, and I love this, information about who they're coming to in the United States and who their nearest relative is in the place they just left. And so sometimes you can get 2 and 3 generations of a family and really detailed specific information about where they were from a passenger list. If you're looking at a passenger list from the late 1800s or the early 1900s, be sure to always check and see if there is a second page. The passenger list, as more information was required, rather than just being a list or a page with names on it, became almost like a ledger. And then it became like a 2-page ledger across 2 pages of paper. Those pages, however, were filmed as separate pages. So always check the next page, and sometimes you'll find even more information. Again, as time wore on, not only did it list the name of the person in the country they just left, but oftentimes it listed a specific town of birth as well. And keep in mind, and this is an important distinction to make, just because a person is from somewhere doesn't mean they were born there, okay? Let me just say that again. Just because a person is from somewhere doesn't mean they were born there. Every one of you, probably, if not for yourself, for somebody you know, could answer the question, where are you from, or where were you born, and have it be a different answer. It certainly is for me. And so, keep in mind that when you're looking at those passenger lists, or you're looking at information about where they sailed from, if somebody says, oh, I came from Hamburg, well, Hamburg was a major port of departure out of Germany, and it was a port of departure for a lot of Europe. And so, just because they came from Hamburg does not mean they were from Hamburg, or that they were born in Hamburg, or that they ever lived there, right? It could just be that the way they understood the question, where are you from, or the way that the question was asked, that's how they responded. So you need to become familiar with what the major ports were as well. When you're looking for passenger lists, keep in mind that in the United States, we have inbound passenger lists. So we have records of people coming into this country. We do not have outbound passenger lists in the United States. We did not keep track of who was leaving on which ships to go where. But other countries do have those records, and a lot of those records are available on Ancestry. So, for example, Germany, they have outbound passenger lists. England, they have outbound passenger lists. And so we can see who is leaving those countries. And sometimes you can find your ancestor in both places, on an outbound passenger list out of Liverpool and on an inbound passenger list into New York. But sometimes, if the passenger list into the United States is missing, you'll need to consult those outbound passenger lists out of those other countries. But again, keep in mind, just because they left from Liverpool doesn't mean they're English. Just because they left from Hamburg doesn't mean they're German. And so you need to, again, make sure you've got all the right information and that you've done this reasonably exhaustive search so that you have as much information to wrap your hands around as possible. Now, inevitably, what's going to happen is as you collect all of this information, you're going to have conflicting evidence. You're going to have, a record that says one thing and 7 records that say something else. And just because 7 is more than 1 does not mean that the 7 are accurate. Okay, you have to consider the source. You have to analyze the information. If all 7 records, if the informant was the same person on all 7 records, that one person could have been wrong. And so the one record that states something different might be the accurate record. So part of the genealogical proof standard is that as we collect all of this evidence from these records, as we create our source citations, that we're analyzing this information, that we're paying really close attention to why this record was created, who the informant was, what the specific questions were that were asked. There's some other things to consider, particularly with immigration. One is that you need to become very familiar with the geography of the area over the time period, both that your ancestor may have lived there and over the time period when they would have been asked about that place. This is particularly important when we start talking about Eastern European immigration. A lot of the boundaries there changed a lot. And so you may have one record that says that your ancestor is from Russia, and another record that says your ancestor is from Austria, and another record that says your ancestor is from Germany or Poland, okay? And that could just be because, when they were born, it was Russia. And then on the census, the year that the census was taken, that they were asked the question, well, the boundaries had changed and now it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then, by the time they died and the person was giving the information, the town they were born in happened to be in Germany or in Ukraine or whatever the case may be. Okay, so just because different documents list a different location doesn't mean they're all wrong. It could mean they're all right. It just depends on the time period. So you need to become familiar with the geography of the area over time, how boundaries shift, and sometimes it's even a benefit to you if they list multiple places. If there are, you can use those locations then to triangulate a more narrow place on a map where they may have been from, because only certain places changed borders. Some of those places deeper in the countries, the boundaries have never changed, but some of those places on the borderlands changed quite a bit, particularly through war periods. So become familiar with the geography. The other thing you need to become familiar with as it relates to the places where your ancestors are from is the political climate and the social sentiment of the time. So, I have an ancestor from Ireland who in many records does not list that he was born in Ireland, lists that he was born in Ohio or that he was born in Indiana, and it's because there was a strong social sentiment at the time against the Irish. And so, that can be a red herring for you if you don't understand. My great-grandfather, who was born in this country, married my great-grandmother, who surprisingly was also born in this country, but she was raised in Texas Hill Country in a German community. Her parents were both German immigrants. German was her first language. She went to a German church. She went to a German school. It wasn't until she got into the junior high age that she started going to a public school and learning English. And so even to her death, I knew her. She spoke with a really strong German accent, even though she was born in Texas. But as we were looking for information about where her parents were from, there was some confusion sometimes about some things. My grandfather had written letters to her during the war, and in his letters to her, he called her his little Dutch girl. Now, most of you, of course, know that the German word for Germany is Deutsch. It's spelled a little differently, pronounced a little differently. And my grandfather was not a dumb man, okay? It's not that he didn't know the difference between Dutch and Deutsch. It's that the sentiment of the time, the political climate, the wartime situation was very anti-German. And so to keep attention off of him and off of my grandmother, he, in these letters that very often were read by military censors, would call her his little Dutch girl. And so if that was the only piece of evidence that we had, if we hadn't done a more reasonably exhaustive search, if that was the family story that had been passed on, we might think that our family was Dutch rather than German. And so, again, you need to think about what was the political climate of the time, what was the social sentiment of the time. Would somebody say that they were something they weren't in order to deflect attention, or in order to get a job, or in order to help their children integrate more fully into U.S. culture? The other thing you need to be thinking about as you're looking at all this evidence you've collected and trying to resolve some of this conflicting evidence is you need to ask yourself who is most likely to have accurate information. Again, death certificates are a great resource for birth information about an individual or about their parents. However, if the informant never knew the parents, how likely is it that my grandfather's third wife, who never met his parents, would have any clue about where his parents were born, right? She may have heard, somebody may have told her, or she may have just made something up to fill out a blank on a form or to answer the question as she's grieving the loss of her husband. So you have to keep that in mind at the time. Again, census records, they're only as accurate as the person who gave the information, but up until the 1940 census, we have no clue who in the household provided the information to the census taker, or if it was even anybody in the household. It could have been the next door neighbor or the guy down the street or the postmaster. Okay, so you have to keep in mind who the informant was for any piece of information, how likely they were to have the accurate information, and based on the kind of record that you're looking at, what is the likelihood that this record is going to be accurate versus something else? So like a passport application or a naturalization application, those are more likely to be accurate as it relates to birthplace than a census record, or even than a death certificate or a birth certificate. So you have to weight that evidence appropriately as you're resolving some of those conflicts, and there will be conflicts in almost every case. Okay, the final step of the genealogical proof standard is a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. And the only reason I include it here is because you've done all this work, okay? You need to explain how the evidence led to your conclusion. When you finally decide this is the town in Poland, or this is the town in Ireland, or the town in England, whatever, where my ancestor was from, and you put that into your database as their birth location, how did you get to that conclusion? And so, write it down. Just, your thought process. That's all you have to do. Just write down your thought process. Here are the 7 records that I looked at, and this is what each of those records said. And here's why I believe this record over this record. Or here's why I think this record says this, even though it's not entirely accurate. Just write it down. Write down your thought process. You can do that in a Word doc, and you can attach it to the person in your tree as a media item. You can do it as a comment in the birth field. You can do it as just a comment on the person. However you do it, just do it. That's part of the genealogical proof standard, is to explain our conclusions. And we do that as much for ourselves as for anybody else. We do that to make sure that we've considered everything before we come to a conclusion. We do that so that we know when we come back to this 10 years later, because a new piece of evidence has surfaced, we can look at this explanation that we've written out, and we can see how this new piece of evidence might fit into that puzzle without having to redo or reanalyze or go through that whole process again, because we've written it down. So be sure to do that, especially when you're working on some of these stickier research problems, so that you don't have to redo your work. Now, as in all things genealogical, When you answer a question, that leads to more questions. So once you find out where your immigrant ancestor came from and when they came, the next question, of course, is, well, how do I find them in the old country? So let me just give you a few tips here to wrap up. The first thing you need to do before you ever start just plugging things into a search engine is to figure out what records exist for that location. Chances are that once you determine where your immigrant ancestor is from, it's going to be a place that you're not terribly familiar with what genealogical records are available. And so take the time to do that. It's going to save you tons of headache and heartache later. It's also going to make sure that you're climbing the right family tree, your own, not somebody else's. Okay, so do a little bit of research. Do a little bit of research online. Do a little bit of research in books. Google the name of the country and maybe the state archive, or Google the name of the town and the word historical society. Right? What you're trying to do is just to get a feel for what kinds of records exist for that location. Did they take a census? When did they start recording births? Was there a state church that recorded birth, marriage, and death records before the civil registration, the government registration began? What kinds of censuses were taken? Were there tax laws that affected who was registered for taxes when? Just anything you can think of that might give you information about the kinds of records that even exist. And then figure out where those records are located. Now, I told you I'd show you where to find records on Ancestry. If you've spent time with me, you know my favorite resource on Ancestry is the card catalog. And if you're not familiar with the card catalog, I strongly encourage you to spend some time there. This is a listing of all of the databases available on Ancestry. You can come in here and you can type in the name of any location, and it will show you all of the databases that Ancestry has for that location. So for example, we have select births and baptisms from 1558 through 1898 for Germany, and this particular database has 110 million records in it. That's a pretty good database. That's a pretty good place to start to have an understanding of what else is available. But don't stop there. Maybe your family's from a particular region, Bavaria, Mecklenburg, Württemberg, Brandenburg, Saxony, whatever. See if there are records more specific to that particular location. So always look at this list. You can do this for any country or for any state. That's how you search the card catalog. The fastest is just to see what records are available for that particular location online. Okay. Now, my final cautions for you before we wrap up, and we're way out of time. Be cautious of a couple things. The first one is the name that your ancestor had in the old country might not be as unique as you think it is for that time and place. So don't just plug a name into a search engine and grab the first one that comes back that matches the right location, okay? Again, the name may be really unique to you, but it may not be that unique for that location. And you won't know that until you do some more research. And so that's my final caution to you, which is be a researcher, not just a searcher. It's really easy just to plug things into a search engine and grab the first thing that pops up. But we need to think about it a little bit. Maybe do a name search in that location and see how many people come up with that particular name. Or maybe don't do a search with a name at all, or just do a surname search, or just do a search by age in a specific location. Lots of different ways to manipulate or work with the data in a particular database online to just get a feel for what it's all about. And again, that's important because we want to make sure that we're climbing our own family trees, not somebody else's. It's really easy, especially when we start moving into records we're unfamiliar with or territory we're unfamiliar with. It's really easy to just grab onto the first thing that looks like it fits into our family puzzle. But then we may end up hitting brick walls. We may end up climbing someone else's family tree. We may have attached the wrong person, whatever. Okay, so be a researcher, not just a searcher. Well, that is all I have prepared for you today, and we are a few minutes over time, so I apologize for that. If you're watching this live, I will be on chat in just a few minutes to answer any additional questions you might have about this topic. I'm also in the process of putting together the May calendar of events for our live stream topics in May, and looking forward to June as well. So if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see us cover, please email me at ask@ancestry.com. I will review those suggestions and have that calendar of events updated in the next week or so. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.